really interested in the problem of Das Ding, and devoted a considerable portion, some big sections to the problem in that book. And in subsequent years, if anything, I've kind of rediscovered it and reappreciated it, and I feel like now somebody really has to talk me out of it. I say that kind of seriously because it's become a kind of switching point for all kinds of problems for me, as if it's now all kinds of problems. In other words, all kinds of concerns and areas of inquiry and so on. It just strikes me now as a absolutely indispensable conceptual piece of the architecture in Lacan's thinking, and which makes it all the more surprising that after it's introduced in the 7th seminar on the ethics, it mostly disappears. Not totally. It does come back a half a dozen times or so in subsequent seminars, but it even disappears from the second half of the 7th seminar, once he takes off on the problem of courtly love and then gets on Antigone. Das Ding isn't mentioned. In the beginning, however, the first half, it's the absolute central act. And Lacan, as you know, for those of you who have read it, he so emphasizes its centrality to the most fundamental problems, particularly the emergence of the signifier, the very foundations of language. He says it's the real center of gravity of all the unconscious Vorstellungen. So it's marked as extremely important, theoretically. You remember the famous formulation about sublimation being the process by which the object is raised to the dignity of the thing. Anyway, I've come back to this problem for a number of reasons, and it's become the kind of centerpiece of a book that I've been working on for the last few years, and I've now finally finished. This is just the manuscript in its kind of form as of last week. It's a book on religion, which is in this version titled "What is Religion? Divinity in Question." Over the weekend, I thought of a much more fun title. It would be something like "Is Nothing Sacred?" and the subtitle would be "Rethinking the Core Idea of Religion." It strikes me that
I like that.
Good.
Nothing.
Is nothing sacred? Of course, the argument of the book is that precisely nothing is sacred. The core of the religious impulse is precisely the subject's relation to Das Ding. So, in that sense, the book is like, it's a kind of descendant cousin or something of Rudolf Otto's book, The Idea of the Sacred, The Idea of the Holy, I guess it's called, where for Otto, the divine is the mysterium tremendum, this kind of book that resonates with apophatic and negative theology so much that not only is the divine beyond being spoken, but it is in itself noumenal, unthinkable, uncategorizable, etc. Except that the way that I have come to think of this and the way I attack it in this book is that, number one, if Das Ding, as the residue, as Freud originally poses it, of the most originary relation to the fellow human being, particularly, of course, the maternal other, if this relationship leaves this trace which affects virtually all subsequent mental life, conscious and unconscious, this trace of a duality between what I recognize effectively in the imaginary, what Freud says I effectively recognize in the other on the basis of the mirroring of the body image, precisely what Lacan thinks about as the imaginary. On the one hand, and on the other hand, something, as Freud says, uncognizable, something ungraspable, something that's there, I know not what, a kind of excess, an unthinkable surplus. If one takes that as the sort of point of departure for reflecting on the question of the religious, then it immediately does two things that Otto has a harder time doing in his book on the idea of the holy. On the one hand, it gives us to understand perhaps why, at least in a purely theoretical sense, why we're not only awed by the numinous, but we're attracted to it. It's what we originally discover in the other, and the other to whom we were most closely and intimately linked. However, of course, it's also, as Lacan goes on to say in the seminar on anxiety, 3 years after the ethics, it is the core, the core stimulant of anxiety. It's that unknown dimension in the face of which I've wrestled with the question, what object am I for the desire of the other? But in addition to that, supplying this moment of attraction, to the noumenal, to what is otherwise anxiety producing, which of course sets up a primordial ambivalence. I mean, in this sense, the thing becomes the privileged trigger, the privileged kind of crux of the most profound and primitive ambivalence. Ambivalence inscribed, you might say, at the absolute zero level of the psyche. But because for the problem, again, of religion, it not only gives us a reason for thinking that there's a very, very profound attraction to this zone of the unknown, but it also links it kind of indelibly and ineluctably with the other subject. And it, therefore, to me anyway, this was my gamble in this book, it therefore gives us to understand an otherwise extremely enigmatic remark of Lacan. You may know this little book that's appeared recently called The Triumph of Religion. The transcription of a part, anyway, of a 1974 interview in Italy, where Lacan makes the astonishing remark that Christianity is the true religion. Specifically, he says the Roman religion is the true religion. Then, tantalizingly, infuriatingly, typically, he doesn't say why. In what sense true? Is it true because it's kind of the atypical religion, the kind of prototype in some sense of the religious? Or is it true in some more conventional sense of touching somehow some structure of reality, claiming truth to be in the more conventional sense? He doesn't say. He does, however, add that Christianity, or the Roman, the one true religion, is, of all religions, he says, the most conspicuously devoted to what he calls the secretion of meaning.
The secretion?
Secretion of meaning. Mm-hmm. And he says this is the reason why religion will gain the upper hand over psychoanalysis. The triumph of the title is going to be due to the seduction accomplished by the secretion of meaning. How religion has infinite resources out of which to spin new threads and webs of meaning, and it can basically do as it will with us, with this infinite supply of renewable meaning. It struck me that, well, first of all, it struck me as just a bizarre moment of Lacan's teaching. It made you almost think maybe he really did have a kind of secret Catholicism with his brother Marc Francois or something, that he was always a kind of closet Catholic that was just kind of playing.
He went to Catholic schools throughout.
He went to Catholic schools throughout, and his mother was extraordinarily devout. So there's plenty of reason for suspicions. But I wondered if it's possible to draw here on this problem of dusting in a way that, as Freud said, I may, like Freud, be making a discovery by virtue of being very poorly read. Maybe someone's already argued this, I've not seen it. But my idea was, or one of the key guiding ideas was, what if Christianity is the one true religion because it's Christianity by virtue of its demand, the Jesus demand that we love not only the neighbor as ourselves, but we love and embrace the enemy as ourselves. It's that which perhaps he again never says it anywhere, but perhaps that's what links Christianity to this problematic, that at least for a brief but very incandescent moment, he says is the cardinal problem of the unconscious. Maybe there's something very special about the religion which brings the unknown out of the shrouds of the myths of the Greek polytheism, out of the enigma of the unnameable God who collars Abraham with his unbelievable demand of circumcision as the price of becoming the father of nations. This religion that ignores, in effect, the transcendental horizon and says, no, the God is there wherever two or more of you are gathered. And the God comes into the world in the love that you extend, despite your anxieties, to the other who you don't know. So that was, in a sense, the spark, you might say, that set me off on this book. But along the way, which was a long way, it's been some years I've been working on this, and I should confess also that I'm coming out of the splendid isolation of writing, which in my case was especially isolating because I had a sabbatical the year before last, which my wife and I spent by renting the house and climbing on our modest sailboat and taking off for a year, during which I wrote 90% of the manuscript. So I was in this splendid, almost psychotic isolation, very enjoyable. But I come back and I kind of don't know how much objectivity I have on what I wrote. So you all have to, that's your function tonight. I won't go in too much about the book. I had thought that you might have read a little piece that I had sent down to Deborah, but I think that didn't get circulated, which maybe is just as well.
I did not circulate it because I didn't know what they wanted that circulated. Okay,
it's a problem of the desire of the other. The unknown desire of the other strikes again. That's okay. Maybe it's just as well. I'm going to try to touch on what was in that. Daniel can maybe fill in. He actually heard this at Clark University last spring. We were on a panel together. Maybe the biggest other helpful thread for me in this whole problematic of dusting, which was relatively new in this encounter with it for me, being kind of the second big encounter. The first one got written up in that book, was coming to the question, is this original structure, which we could name and imagine in Lacanian terms as a bifold structure that is both imaginary, offering a moment of recognition, of orientation, and real, harboring some kind of horizon of something both unknown and, in being unknown, potentially threatening. is it possible to take that, as Freud's brief text almost invites us to, as really, really fundamental, as giving a kind of template, a kind of schema for the most primitive activity of subjectivity? Lacan seems to invite that very thing, or something like it, when he talks in the ethics seminar introducing the das Ding, when he talks about it as, and I could get the quotes out of here, but I would just try to evoke them. He talks about, in the most fundamental terms, about the function of the signifier as just almost identical to this experience of das Ding. Is it possible to just read this bifold structure, real and imaginary and real, into every iteration of the signifier? Number one. And number two, if I'm correct and if it's sustainable that the religious impulse can in some very significant way be anchored in this experience of das Ding, is this bifold character, imaginary and real, imageable and unthinkable, is that also to be found in some very central and repeating way across a range of different religious traditions? Is that, can one really take that to the bank as a kind of fundamental structure that transcends religious differences? On the first point about this question of this structure in the signifier, I began,
When you say the signifier, is this just the idea of signifier as in all signifiers, or is the concept of the signifier as opposed to a particular signifier? The signifier.
Yeah, when I'm using it, what I'm meaning is any signifier. And here's how I would illustrate it. That, and this seems to me thoroughly Lacanian, but maybe with a new emphasis. That we have, with every signifier, if I use any word, if I even use the word use, it has, as we say, a denotation, a more or less specific signification. It points to some object or activity or state of affairs. And that's relatively, we call it its meaning. And Lacan actually, in one text, I believe it's the third seminar, he says meaning is essentially imaginary. It's a moment of recognition, precisely parallel to that moment of the early infant's realization that the mother is somehow a mirror image of itself. But there's also, of course, we say in ordinary theory of language, we say there's not only the denotation, there's also connotation. There's a penumbra of incomplete tendrils and reverberations of meaning that cannot be stabilized, can't be given simply. And this seems to me is a really key moment of Lacan's theory of language, which in different periods he gives different voice to. But the idea is something like a potential beyond the specific denotation signification of any signifier, any fragment of linguistic form. A kind of horizon of something as yet to be determined, called up by any word. And I write a good deal about it, this problem in the two big chapters that precede discussions of religion, where I'm trying to sort of get the toolkit established. But it seems to me that a lot can and should be said here about the theory of language that emerges from this, because it really is, I think, a distinctive theory of language. This theory of language which puts the emphasis on the indeterminate horizon that is stimulated without ever taking any specific form. So it doesn't rise to the level of the semantic. I play with the word semantic and say, well, maybe this indeterminate horizon deserves to be called simply not semantic, but simply mantic, as in the old use of the word mantic, as even a Diotima of Plato's Symposium is said to be the priestess from Mantia. The mantic as the kind of insane, in fact, and inspiration, or kind of like divine madness and so on, that sort of thing. In any event, it struck me as at least plausible to make this leap, to see this fundamental structure, imaginary and real, which Freud sketches in his conception of dusting and Lacan incorporates in some way, to carry it over into Lacan's whole notion of the signifier. That every time we use language, something of this originary split between something recognized and something excessive that remains ungrasped and ungraspable is repeated. It strikes me also that if you allow that theoretical leap, it's possible to even say, it seems to me, that in even the most elemental moment, I talk in the book about the elemental matrix of the signifier, that the signifier it embodies and enacts a certain primordial ambivalence. It's both an attempt to name something and to stabilize one's relationship with something. You might say to domesticate it, to make it a function of what you can know, and therefore you can feel confident your relation with is stabilized. But it also inevitably calls up an excess that you don't control, about which you're at least potentially anxious. So language, on this model, on this reading, language contains ambivalence at the most absolutely fundamental level. It's all flexed with a certain ambivalence. It's all haunted, you might say, by potential anxiety, insofar as the ordinary meanings of things inevitably call up a margin of something extraordinary, indeterminate, and as yet to be determined. Let me pause there. Is this making sense so far?
Very interesting.
Yeah?
When you use ambivalence, I wonder if behind that or prior to that, we can work perhaps better with the absence and presence,
Mm-hmm.
like Lacan does with the four da.
Mm-hmm.
Because he talks about the four da as an example of the constitution of the subject
Mm-hmm.
from Seminar 11. And how this back and forth of the child with the mother, and then sort of to put his feet on the ground, and he plays with the object,
Yeah.
because otherwise he cannot put his feet on the ground, so to speak.
Yeah.
So there is the absence and presence of the mother that translates into his own absence and presence.
Mm.
And then the role of the object that really comes kind to give him some support, you know.
Yeah. And
And,
Freud.
and there's a lot of ambivalence there. I mean, we could use that, but it's kind of a little bit different if we use absence, presence, you know. of the constitution of the subjectivity.
And Freud remarked it, and then Lacan accentuates it even further, that how interesting, how challenging and unexpected in a sense, at least from the point of view of the pleasure principle, how unexpected that the child seems to enjoy, perhaps even most enjoy, the fort moment, the disappearance moment, the throwing it away moment, the sort of moment in which he if the little spiel, if the little what do you call it, the little bobbin or whatever it was, is a stand-in for the maternal object.
Yes.
It's the throwing it away that gives the thrill.
Yeah, actually, if I remember correctly, what
as much
Freud
if not more than
discovered with the baby was
retrieving.
that he would throw lots of objects, and then occasionally we'd play the game before that. But there was a lot of throwing, a lot of pushing the mother,
Yeah.
This, working with the object.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I feel I need to preface almost whatever I say about my limited knowledge of Lacan, but some of what you were talking about seems to be some of the same words or language that's used when the real is described in terms of something being ineffable and that you can't capture. So I wonder about the relationship to the real and what you're talking about here, maybe regarding the religious idea and then some other thoughts. And also Lacan has talked about all knowledge is tinged with paranoia. So I like that idea a lot.
Yeah.
And in terms of being frightened or afraid of maybe knowing what's unknowable, and the idea that maybe if we didn't know about it, it would be a very scary sort of frightening thing. That comes to mind too. And then the third idea that escapes me. Jouissance aussi, also being kind of an unbearable excitation. Just a couple words to capture an idea.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I am, maybe in philosophy more than in the psychological domain, get exposed to other kinds of theories of language, and I must say, from this point of view, from this way of reading that piece of Lacanian theory and rethinking it a bit over the last few years, I'm more appreciative of how both rich but also unusual his theory of language is, for its emphasis on this indeterminacy. That he makes the fundamental Saussurean point much more radically, that in no way is the signifier, the name, merely a tag for the thing. On the contrary, the most important moment is the moment of this calling up of something without a name, and that has no thinghood. In this case, das Ding, the thing, is precisely not a thing at all, but a kind of zone of something formless and uncognizable. And this Lacan, I think if I'm reading it correctly, this is actually what he thinks is the most important function of language. Not what it tells us, it's what it doesn't tell us, but which it somehow evokes, somehow calls up.
Does that relate to the objet in terms of the desire for something that doesn't exist? And I wonder if das Ding is the thing that doesn't exist, but that the objet tries to, is that drives the object causing desire.
Right.
It drives us to try to capture this thing that doesn't exist.
Right. Well, this is in a way the $64 question that comes up whenever you start taking das Ding seriously is, okay, well, didn't he effectively replace das Ding with the objet?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the in between position could be that as Ding is a way for the unknown mother of which the child is not certain but has to give up. And the question is if no connection can be made between das Ding and the mother who is not known and has to be given up as well.
Well, it seems to me that, and I don't have perfect confidence about my own view of this, but I do think that it's unquestionable, and I don't know how to answer this question at all. Unquestionable that Lacan mostly ceases to talk of das Ding. He brings it back half a dozen crucial times. Particularly in the anxiety seminar, although even there he only says it once. He says, perhaps, you know, the theme, one of the big themes is Freud he overplayed his hand when he said anxiety has no object.
Yes.
It does have an object. And of course, most of the time in the anxiety seminar, it's l'objet A.
Yes.
That is that object. But in one particular passage toward the end of the seminar, he says something like, no, anxiety does have an object, the most primal object, das Ding. So there's a really very important kind of check mark put there that he's still thinking about this. For some reason, here's where I don't know how to explain it, for some reason he's become reticent to talk about it. He'd prefer to talk about das Ding, about l'objet A. However, there's another wonderful little clue in the 16th seminar where he comes back to das Ding. There he gives it quite a few mentions, actually, maybe 4 or 5. But one of them I think is particularly charming. He says, l'objet A, the petit A, is the thing that tickles das Ding from the inside. It's the French tickler that disturbs or kind of animates das Ding from inside. The way that I read it, and I don't know if this is fully satisfying, but the way that I've come to read it is through the extended discussion toward the end of the 10th seminar, where he talks about les objets cessibles, the seedable object. And this is his gloss on the famous part objects. He says the breast, the feces, the phallus, and so on, these part objects identified by Freud as crucial in the early development of the child's psyche. He says these are objects that are seedable. That is to say, they can be given up. And Lacan says this of the breast in particular, and then of course it's very, very true of the feces. It's the object that the birthing subject, the emerging subject, can relinquish.
CEDE.
Yes, cede it, to cede it over, to give it up, as if like the lizard. I think he even mentions this at one point. It's the lizard who gives it up its tail to make its escape. The implication would seem to be that the child has to get some breathing room from the mother. You get and the breast is understood in this context to be really the child's. He or she, the child, gives it up, relinquishes it, says, "Oh, you can have it." And this he identifies with the petit A. Its first kind of inscriptions. But it seems to me this gives us a wonderful opportunity. He does not make this explicit, but this is my reading of it, but it seems to me very convincing, at least suggestive, that the very motive for the seeding is to put this anxiety-producing unknown dimension of the mother, precisely her unknown desire, in the face of which I face an abyssal kind of question of what object am I for this desire. When I seed something, in effect saying, you take it, I escape. A distance is is opened up between the emerging subject and the maternal other. Then Lacan follows it by saying the first vocalizations also are objets cessibles. They're seeded into the space between this infant and the mother. The first cries function then really as, we would say, the most primitive declarations of independence. It says, hey, you stay over there. I'll stay over here, thank you.
The symbolic makes a cut in the real.
Exactly. So, and this fits where otherwise other places suggest that the real function of language includes even more primordially a disjunction with the other than a conjunction. The connection, or what he likes to call communication. in a lot
Language
of his
is meant to
texts.
be misunderstood.
Exactly. It's meant to carve out the position of the subject and affect a separation, even more primordially than it is to be a connection. A point which goes perfectly hand in glove with the earlier point about perhaps the function of language is precisely not to say something, to leave open the question of what is being said, even more primordially than to say just that, of a specific determinate means.
So if we say we have no idea what the fuck we're talking about, you could say, you got it.
I meant it. You got it, right, exactly. You can just imagine Lacan enjoying that, yeah.
A couple thoughts. One would be, I love the split of language, this new theory you're offering. Would la langue, the concept of la langue, be a way of addressing the connotative, this other domain, this maternal domain of language that you've recognized as split, as sort of being sort of within it and not being sort of within the field of the desire of the other, which is this space of meaning, the symbolic, right? Mm-hmm. So would you think about it like that, maybe?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
my other point would be, when dusting is introduced, as a lot of commentators have noted, this is Lacan's peak Heidegger phase. So I wonder what you think about Heidegger's own treatment of dusting, but also, come to think of it, isn't the category of nothingness like also a way that Lacan was trying to say, here is what psychoanalysis has to say about the emergence of the category of the nothing, right?
Yes.
And the way in which dusting plays into that. And then of course he then goes on to look at the Kantian noumenal thing, but he doesn't quite talk about dusting exactly, but you're drawn to assume that this is sort of a way that we think about it. So those are a couple points I want you to sort of reflect on. And then finally, there's a lot of new work on Lacan's terms and marks and how that coincides with his concurrent conversation with the part objects with Melanie Klein, but also with the development and the refinement of this notion of Marx invented the symptom is a famous phrase of Lacan's. And there's a new book called Lacan and Marx, published by Verso by Seno Tomsik, which basically makes an argument that we should understand objet art as a kind of effect of modernity and the way that we relate to desire within capitalist social systems. Very interesting argument. It's actually in the seminar, The Other, I forget the exact title, but I believe it's 1967.
From the other to another, yeah.
Correct. It's there that objet art really takes preeminence, and then dusting is kind of eclipsed, I think.
Yeah.
So I wonder what you think about the connection, because Lacan always has these sort of philosophers who he's in a larger dialogue with that kind of inform his concept making, so to speak. And so I think a lot of commentators have therefore said, well, the dusting was his Heidegger phase, and then he got out of that.
Yeah.
Do you sort of, I'm assuming you push back on that.
At least half of it, but only half.
Yeah.
I mean, to go to your first point, Daniel, the business about La Langue, I think that's exactly how I now see it. Yeah,
It's a really nice way to think about La Langue.
Yeah, but it's a. I think one of the reasons it seems to me valuable to not allow dusting to slip off the table completely is that it gives a way of understanding there's something about the space in which the game of la langue is played, if we could say it that way. Or maybe to use another expression that occurs in the 20th seminar along with la langue, signifiance, as opposed to signification. When he says this word, and it's not only in the 20th seminar, he starts it earlier than that by quite a bit, but this word signifiance, which to my understanding is a neologism of his. It's a mild one, but nevertheless it's not an ordinary French word, the way signification is.
Yeah.
Signification could be taken as corresponding to the semantic import of the signifier, that it points to a particular meaning. But signifiance
It's deeper.
is, yes.
Signifiance is a French word, but it's deeper. It's more intimate.
So it's not, it's familiar in
It's
French,
different
but
of signification. It's like intimate, more intimate. It's deeper.
and would you
Signifiance.
say it's less well defined? In other words, that signifiance is more somehow maybe a more
More
intuitive
universal.
or more.
So intimate and universal.
Uh-huh.
It's difficult to explain.
Anyway, I sort of wanted to associate this
That's interesting.
this domain of there's something about the thingly dimension is being tickled.
Yes. It's difficult.
by
It's
this.
different. It's another space.
Mhm.
Right.
Signification.
Could we connect that in a certain sense with that? Signifiance is so intimate that it's estimate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's because he uses the concept of estimate, something that is so intimate that it's beyond, it's estimate.
Is it
And
like
yes,
a
exactly.
meaning,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
meaning not only addressed to the other, but also retroactively addressed to my own dusting in a certain interior sense?
Well, of course, it's important to remember that extimité is coined by Lacan precisely
yes.
in relation to dusting.
Right. Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
It's not. It's exactly
Wow.
a way of. That's when he comes up with it.
Yeah. And I would be very interested if you continue elaborating, because one of my attractions to this concept is the whole connection with religion,
Mm-hmm.
which I think you talk about very well in the things I have read, because I wonder, or at least as I listen to you and as I think about it, in a certain sense, I think we could say, I don't know if you agree, that objet A is a kind of development from das Ding, meaning that
An aspect of the thing.
Pardon me?
An aspect of the thing that
it's an aspect of
provokes desire.
it's an aspect of das Ding that creates a chain for objects, whereas das Ding stays beyond. It's sort of the reservoir. It's not. It doesn't bring any chain, but it is the source. It's the mind, so to
Yeah,
speak.
yeah, yeah.
And what interests me is the behavior of very simple people, like in Latin America, where I grew up in the countryside, and how people use religion to deal with tragedy, with illness, with things, in a way that they don't have to struggle with desire in the way we do. Because I think as we talk about desire, it's sort of a more developed way already, whereas das Ding is a more primordial, as you say. And looking at the people in the countryside, how this sort of, it's a very imaginary but primordial way how they can, which of course can lend itself to wonderful things and to awful things, both, so anyway.
I mean, I often find that the descriptions of l'objet petit a as a kind of stain or a
Okay.
blemish or this strange, out of context, out of focus, the thing in the periphery, even the thing that distracts you and is annoying. I love the example that Zizek, I think is, I don't know if he points to this first, but the beauty mark of Marilyn Monroe, her mole on her
Yes.
cheek and so on,
Yes.
functions as objet petit a.
Yeah.
But it seems to me very easy to link it to Das Ding. Here you have this incandescently beautiful face that then is strangely marred in a way that you find sort of pleasing, though you don't understand why. Isn't it because it calls up something about this face, about this woman, about her particular magnetism that you don't understand?
Mm-hmm.
Something beyond the face that's made accessible precisely by this little mar of the face, this little... it's funny, I'm pointing to my own. I have a mole in the same spot. It doesn't perform the same function. Or here's another example. I was on the phone with someone recently. We were talking in Lacanian terms about Moby Dick, and they were saying, well, maybe Ahab's wooden leg is the objet petit a, that somehow evokes the whale that chewed it off, you know, and maybe the whale is Das Ding, and the wooden leg is what evokes it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course that's possible. It's also possible to say Moby Dick himself or itself is the petit a, because and what does it stand for? It stands for precisely the absolutely unknowable depth of being. This very whiteness of the whale, that extraordinary chapter about the whiteness, the opacity of the white and so on, which evokes something unthinkable. Perhaps, you know, Das Ding is always the dimension which is receding. But I guess I want to hold on to it. And I want to say, you know, this helps to understand Lacan, it seems to me. But then it comes back to the question, Daniel, I think you were asking about, well, okay, why did he stop talking about it? And I do think it was a certain distancing himself from Heidegger.
Yeah.
And that was part of it, from Heidegger.
There's a famous little correspondence between Heidegger and the late Lacan, where he sent him the Borromeo knots, and they met in person, and Heidegger put them down and walked on. Like, I have no interest in what you're doing.
Yeah,
so they had a real theoretical break, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, I think...
but they were very close. Like friends, from what theoretical friends in some sense.
I don't think it was very reciprocal, though.
The whole time.
I mean, I think Lacan had a great admiration for Heidegger and great hope for a theoretical friendship or something. But after Heidegger finally agrees to visit Lacan in France, he returns home and tells the Swiss psychiatrist Medard Boss. He says, I think that the psychiatrist needs a psychiatrist. I mean, I think he thought that Lacan was kind of mad. But it's interesting, I think Heidegger, you know, he says in the essay, What is Metaphysics? He so evocatively says, the human being is held out into the nothing. I think, as I read Lacan's concept of Das Ding, that's a nice way to summarize it. We are held out into the nothing. That language, that our entire life of subjectivity hangs us out into this extimité. Because we are ourselves inhabited by something indeterminate and incomprehensible, which is ourself.
And see, and it's important that this concept of extimacy, extimité, it's intimately connected with intimacy.
Yeah.
That it is profoundly intimate, but it is so intimate that it is extimate. You cannot reach it, you cannot touch it. And that's, for me, it's a very rich way to.
Yeah, and this links us back to the religious thing. in the transition from Greek paganism, well, it isn't a transition. The Jews don't become Jews because they reject Greek paganism, but they do reject polytheism in some general way. What does it mean that suddenly the ancient Hebrew culture arises with this encounter with a single other subject who is almost completely enigmatic? So much so that no name will do. In fact, one has to prescind from even trying to name. Well, the best we can do is something like Hashem. This is an extraordinary step closer to the real encounter with Dasting as the excess of another subject. I mean, the Greeks, as Freud commented so much on, the Greeks personify the natural forces. They turn them into persons. But as Nietzsche observes so trenchantly, I think, the fact that there are lots of these others was great for the Greeks. It was like a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you did something incredibly stupid or impulsive or cowardly, you could always say, well, there was a God in me, you know. You had a wonderful out for all sorts of shameful stuff. But there's no out with Yahweh. You know, you're absolutely directly in the face of an infinite demand. And this, I think, it seems clear to me that it is a kind of way in which the upsurge of a religious tradition, Dasting has been approached so much more directly.
But that was already present in Persia.
In Persia.
Persians made very big.
With Zoroaster?
No, not Zoroaster, but
Elagabal?
the what?
Elagabal?
Marduk.
Oh, Marduk.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So do you look at Moses and monotheism with an eye towards the Dasting, where I think it's Freud's seminal commentary on religion, right? And as I understand it, it was it's almost a sublimatory act of facing the trauma of the primal event of the murder of the father, which creates, the latency period and allows Judaism to advance precisely by its orientation to that traumatic event in a certain way as a religion of reason, as a rational religion, which gives it its mark. But I'm wondering, do you think of how Dasting fits into that founding moment in a way?
Well, this is maybe where I'm not sure if it's where I go the furthest to sort of, in my own interpretation, maybe that's not true, but I mean, I make a great deal, it seems to make a lot of sense to me that Dasting, by the time it arrives in the seventh seminar, retroactively makes sense of Lacan's whole effort. I mean, it makes sense, for instance, of the paternal metaphor, that the signifier, the name of the father, is substituted in the place of the desire of the mother. The desire of the mother is the problem. But then it impresses me more, I guess I should say more than ever, that this is a key point, maybe the key point where Lacan really departs from Freud.
Huh.
The problem is not that the child needs to be torn away from the mother. The child has always already torn itself away with the dynamics of speech, with these objets sensibles, with the whole kind of battery of distancing stratagems. In this sense, I make a note about how this is the analysis of Simone de Beauvoir, where she says the mother, the maternal, which stands for the whole kind of carnal attachment, is distanced by the child, that the child weans itself. There's a number of passages in the anxiety seminar where Lacan says exactly that. He says the child weans itself. it totally does away with at least the crudest form of the Oedipus as Freud formulated it, that the child needs to be basically threatened, torn away under penalty of castration. Here we get something very, very different. Yes, a continued longing for attachment, a kind of moth to the flame that endures an impulse of kind of like regressive, fusion is retained, yet the child itself, and here we have the whole dynamic of the ego and everything.
So, Spitz analyzed that relation between mother and child, and the first form of language, no saying, is a separation from the mother and the child, whereby the child borrows the sound by which it is frustrated constantly. No, don't do that, no, don't do that. But it remains within a unit, mother-child, in which there is opposition. And
right.
I as a chair, I saw students who had a child, and they came, and the child was quibbling with the mother. And when I came and I say, how are you? It held on immediately to the mother. That means that the separation is a separation in fusion and not a complete separation. And so Freud, but even better Lacan, argues that the child needs a reference to a third by which it can borrow what it believes to be the mark that the mother likes in the father and takes it its own. And therefore it transforms itself separate from the fusion with the mother.
Is this part of a broader sort of move away from the relationship to the mother directly, so that sort of object remains as part of this fundamental dynamic with the child and then the mother as other, but there's something about Seminar 7 where the problem is broader, it's social, so that something about Das Ding relates to this version of this problem of the role of object but as it relates to the other more broadly. Is it that there's something insufficient about grafting another aspect onto object to serve this function that is something more even than this relationship?
I've gone at least halfway down the road of wanting to totally retain the link between the two, Objet A and Das Ding, as if Objet A is the whole kind of train of traces which in one way or another call up something of the dimensionality of Das Ding. That is to say, they call up they evoke some kind of excess, some kind of indeterminate horizon. One of the ways in which I illustrate this, or try to, is I go back to the Jakobson's analysis of mama and papa, where Jakobson gives this theory that about the reiteration of the phoneme, ma, ma. Why the second one? Why not just ma? And Jakobson theorizes that the second iteration of ma retroactively indicates that the first one is a signifier. It's not just a sound. Ma needs its second ma to actually announce that I'm saying something. It's a name. But then I did this little riff where I said, well, what if the reiterated phonemes, not to take away from Jakobson's point, I think it's correct, but to do another sort of level of analysis, what if the ma number 1 and the ma number 2 correspond to this duality of the relation, as Freud says, the complex der Nebenmensch, the complex of the neighbor, the relation to the other, which divides into the imaginary moment of recognition, but the uncanny excessive moment of das Ding. What if the ma and pa, this extremely, I don't know if it's universal, but it's extremely conspicuous around the world, even in the palatal and labial, enunciations. But what if that duality is being repeated there? If that's true, the example of Chinese is extremely interesting, because ma, the Chinese also say ma, like so many other cultures, ma. But ma in Chinese means with different tonality. Actually, if you say it with the right tone, it means horse. Forget about that. But it can mean mother with one tonal pronunciation, and the other tonal pronunciation is the particle that indicates the question. So you say blah 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 blah, ma, like we say so and so and so. No, this is a very interesting book. No, something like that. You put this particle at the end of the sentence, and that's a question mark. It's very interesting. I mean, I don't know if this is true, but I fell in love with this little tiny theroid. Ma. Maybe the second one both indicates that the first is a signifier, but also underlines that every signifier opens more questions than it answers. Something like that.
Ni hao ma.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So is it fair to say that Lacan was interested in the Marquis de Sade and Antigone and these sort of heroic figures of dusting, maybe even Jesus Christ, because they came up with innovative ways to address the lingering problem of dusting in the world, in society, in different ways? Is that his sort of, because I was struck by that, like religion has a certain avenue to get at it, art has a certain avenue to get at it, science has a certain avenue to get at it. The strategies, right? Somebody was talking about Greta Thunberg as a modern day Antigone. I thought that was a zigzag actually, but it's a perfect point. Like, how is she evoking the das Ding of the policy world in some sense, It's kind of interesting. Is that how you read those figures though? Like they're channeling it? Like how would you see what I'm saying? I'm kind of asking you to riff.
Maybe this is a good chance, because I realize we're not going to go forever, are we? So 8:45, another 20 minutes? Is that even too long?
No. We can stop at 8:45 or 9.
Okay. Maybe I'll take this as an opportunity to say the second stage of the business about religion. Everything, I basically say, what if the signifier, in its very primordial, most elemental cell, has the structure of a symptom. Has the structure of a symptom. It both gives us something definite. It gives us, you might say in ordinary linguistic terms, the denotation, but it also calls up an excess. If this assumes, or this supposes that the original complex, der Nebenmensch, the complex of the neighbor which situates the thing, is already the structure of the symptom. Both are there. I recognize something, but then there's something else. And I basically, the fundamental thesis of the book is that religion is the primordial symptom of the human being. Religion is essentially symptomatic. Why? Because it's, in one way or another, in various religions, it is an opening towards something unknown. Yeah, nothing is actually the core of the sacred experience. It's a worship of nothing. Or divinity in question, like the other subtitle, which I think is now not as much fun. But no religion, it appears, can stand it, this exposure. You have to then rush in with reassuring defensive formations that stabilize this opening to the real. And that's different in different religions. I make the argument that in Judaism, which makes this astonishing breakthrough to the real of Hashem, this is stabilized precisely in the halakhic rules that organize life so completely and satisfyingly, and enable this enormous, fraternity of obedience and so on. But then in Christianity, who almost one-ups Judaism in its directness of approach to Das Ding, it means Das Ding is you and me. It is right here. It is as if in Christianity, go back to the secretion of meaning, it has to flee this moment of eruption of the real more than any other, because it's basically saying, wherever I meet human eyes, that's it. I'm challenged by this infinite demand to embrace not just the other, but what is most other in the other. And so Christianity then becomes the most symptomatic religion that rushes in with all this forest of icons and images, and also with the demand, it divinizes the messenger, the very divinization of Jesus, you could say, is the precise opposite of his message. He's basically saying, look, this is Hegel's view. God is not this infinite being in an infinite transcendent realm. God is what happens when we share and are transformed by love. That's God. But this is almost intolerable. And Christianity substitutes these various defensive kind of structures to sort of stabilize itself. One of which, the big one of which is, which strikes me as, you guys may correct me on this, I'm infinitely nervous about writing a book about religion, which is something I know almost nothing about.
You're the best person to write it.
Maybe. Just because I have anxiety about it. As regards, and in contrast to Judaism and Greek polytheism in particular, neither of those religions strike me as terribly invested in belief. The Greeks in particular, but also Judaism. It's not a religion of belief, it's much more a religion of performance, of obedience, of... Sorry?
It's mostly power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Religion is power. It's manipulation and power. But else, and for women, it's worse.
Well,
So
yeah,
the
maybe.
symptom for women is worse. So I don't know, but for me it's a big manipulation for all religions.
In Judaism, you're saying?
Judaism, Buddhism, Christianism, Muslims. For, I think all religions, it's manipulation. It's only power.
Yeah. Well, this is
Power,
what I'm calling the
power of
symptomatic
man
dimension.
And mostly, and so
Yeah.
religion is for me, for a lot of people, it's that.
Yeah.
So, and I think Lacan is not religious at all. I don't know, I'm not sure that I understood every thing that you say, but Lacan was very aware of everything of religion. He doesn't speak so much about religion, I don't think so.
But I wonder if this is my way of, and I don't know if this succeeds. I have to publish the book and have everyone attack it in order to know what I've written. But what I'm basically saying is that the difference between Lacan and Freud is Freud tended to really focus on what I'm calling the defensive, symptomatic dimension of religion.
Yeah.
Religion is fundamentally defensive. And Lacan sees, I think, and this is, I think, why he returns like a moth to the flame to the questions of religion and religious writers and mysticism and all sorts of stuff. I mean, he even famously compares his own écrit to the writings of the mystics and so on. I think he thinks there is a kind of moment in genuine religious life of an opening to the real, which is compensated for by defensive, symptomatic structures, which often all but overpower with sad effects. But I think, as I read it, Lacan is recognizing that Freud didn't see this. For Freud, it's all defense.
Illusion.
It's
illusion.
Yeah, Yeah, it's illusion, which illusion is the way, the drug, the narcotic we give ourselves to allay our own feeling of helplessness, our exposure to our helplessness. And Lacan wants to say, I think, there's something worse than helplessness. It's the dereliction of my relation to this thing in the other. It's not just that I'm powerless, relatively powerless, it's that I'm in relationship to this extimacy, that I'm outside myself. And I have to recontact that, that I'm made anxious by.
Yalom would say the terror of death, in his book, Staring at the Sun, Overcoming the Terror of Death. It's very nice. He brings in religious thinking, philosophical ideas. Yeah, that's what we're all trying to
This is the
grapple
part
with.
I feel least confident about, is the end, where I try to assess, okay, am I saying that Lacan's not really the atheist he said he was? I have to stick with that. I think he's confirmed atheist. But I think it's extremely difficult to say this.
Then
I
you
think
say
he is,
only an atheist can believe.
he's
makes these
fascinating.
crazy
I think he's a
formulations.
complicated atheist.
You were saying something about belief, but you didn't finish. That Christianity and Judaism are not religions of belief.
And I think Christianity, I have one section I call Christianity, how Christianity invented ideology. Christianity invents, Kierkegaard is all about this, Christianity invents interiority, which means the life of faith, belief faith, which would have been absurd to the Greeks. But belief is then a very weird thing. Belief undoes the very thing that the Jesus demand tried to open up. It tries to open up an unhesitating, unrestrained openness to the other. And belief, as people like Robert Fowler say so elegantly, belief is a social, not an epistemological reality. In other words, belief defines the believer over and against the others who don't believe.
That's true.
And it simultaneously solves the problem of dusting in two ways. Those who believe as I do cease to be ding, cease to be dusting. They're like me. They make us the same. They link us in an imaginary conspiracy. And those who don't believe as I do, they become a new kind of ding, a new kind of object, a bad object, but one I am fully licensed to attack and ignore. So the Jesus command is in both cases nullified. The opening to the real that this strange rabbi wandering around opens up is completely shut down by Christianity.
Perhaps for philosophers there are atheists, believers, and agnostics, but in the real world there are many fewer atheists in foxholes.
Yes, I know. So they say. Yeah, right.
Well, I guess you'd have to do a study.
No
to
atheists in
find out.
Foxhole. Yeah. I must say one last thing. We're getting to the end, I think, but I've become a little obsessed with this Lacan's thing about dusting, about how our social world is structured around both awareness of this uncanny, anxiety-producing dimension of the other subject as a subject who I don't know. There's something in there I just don't know. And I'm avoiding it like crazy. But I'm also drawn to it. I'm a sort of have this unsettled relation with it. And eye contact is the perfect example. We can't allow ourselves, in almost all societies, more than a few moments of eye contact before it becomes weird. Before it becomes an uncomfortable question about what are we doing, and what are you thinking of me, and what am I supposed to be thinking of you, and so on and so forth. I was just reading Malcolm Gladwell's new book. Maybe you've been reading it, Talking to Strangers. And you would think it would be an obvious, right off the top of it, denial about anything like Das Ding. Because basically his thesis is we're much too trusting of strangers, incredibly naive, and we don't realize how they're scheming and so on and so forth. But of course, it's actually from a slightly different point of view. Gladwell's thesis is totally compatible with the Lacanian understanding of Das Ding. That the other is our nightmare. And social life is the elaborate dance by which we ignore the nightmare. We just are very adept at construing one another as perfectly predictable. Here we are doing our usual thing, blah blah blah. As long as we don't meet our eyes for too long. And so
we need the veil.
Yeah.
We need the veil
Yeah.
to be able
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
And this is the role of the law, yes? I mean,
The what?
this is the role of the law.
The-
Yes,
It's
the-
characterized here.
Yes,
that
exactly.
it-
The role of the law is
simultaneously describing the
yeah,
regular,
yeah, exactly.
like the Ten Commandments, the things that
Yeah.
we do all the time anyways.
Right.
By prohibiting, it creates the veil and also grants access
Yes.
to Das Ding by
That's right. That's right. That's right.
oppressive.
Who wrote La Recherche de ton perdu? Qui est-il? Le nom.
Proust. Proust.
Proust,
Marcel
exactly.
Marcel
Yeah.
Proust.
So he talks about anytime you put two people in a room together, you have a sexual relationship. Unacknowledged for the most part.
Right.
But maybe that's looking too long, gazing too long into the other person's eyes.
Hell is other people, as Sartre said.
Right. Yeah. Although I think this is another way to understand why Lacan was not only is Heidegger possibly too close to him
But
with
also
this
Sartre,
Dustin,
yeah.
but Sartre also.
Absolutely.
But he shouldn't have had this nervousness because Sartre's problem is he thinks subjectivity, consciousness, my consciousness itself is the nothing. I am the nothing. Consciousness is
Yes,
this.
yes, but the other grants me my access to my nothing. So the other plays a seminal role in the revelation of the contingency of my own nothingness. I don't give myself my nothingness.
I don't know if
I only say because I'm teaching being nothingness right now.
Oh yeah? But isn't it, it's also the case though that what I really have to fear from the other is being made an object under their
Absolutely.
gaze.
Absolutely.
So here
True.
I'm robbed of my transcendence
That's true.
insofar as the other seizes the advantage of subjectivity and I become merely gazed upon.
True, but the other initiates like the for itself, right? So
I think in a certain sense the other guarantees my transcendence as well. But
Yeah.
I cannot guarantee my transcendence alone.
Yeah.
correct.
I need the other
Definitely,
to guarantee
definitely,
my transcendence.
definitely.
But what I think is, so different in Lacan's view is that the original encounter with the nothing,
Yeah.
if in Heidegger's words, we are held out into the nothing,
Right.
it's the other who is that original nothing,
Yeah.
not me. I come to know
Yeah.
my own nothingness in and through the encounter with Das Ding and the other. So back to extemité. Which is also the Heideggerian thing, by the way. Heidegger thinks Dasein is, he thinks I'm anxious because I have a kind of vertigo in the, this is similar to Sartre, I have a vertigo of my own possibility. So Dasein is its own abyss. I'm an abyss to myself. And I think Lacan is, the interesting thing is he says, no, it's, in the first place, it's the other that's the problem. The anxiety producing abyss is precisely the eyes of the other, not my confrontation with myself. This is,
Did you find other sort of religious symbolism that was, I find the stuff in this book like the vase, the Heidegger's vase, very interesting. He uses the temple, and we were talking, of course, of the Christ, which I feel like there's this sort of resonances there between these symbols and the idea of the signifier of signifiers and Das Ding. Did you, in writing this book, find more of those? Or sort of resonances across other
The most fun one, in a word, yeah, but I just reported on a lot of them. There's a lot of vases and temples that return in here, but the most fun discussion was the one about following up on Walter Benjamin's suggestion that capitalism is its own religion, and money, of course, its own god. And to say that cash is the thing was a lot of fun.
Is that right?
There's a whole section on that.
How about Islam?
There's a long section on Islam.
Was that hard?
It was. Everything was hard. It was an education. The thing that makes me most nervous about it, is I'm quite critical.
Really?
The only thing that makes me feel better is I'm even more critical about Christianity than I am about Islam.
Really?
I say Christianity is the most symptomatic, the most violently symptomatic. I say at one point, one of the to me, most gratifying payoffs of the book is it explains the bizarre irony that Christianity in the history of the world has been the most violent religion, which I don't know if that sounds contestable to you, but I think it's probably true. But this violence is conducted precisely in the name of the ultimate religion of love. And I think I offer at least a certain angle of interpretation that makes sense of that paradox. But then I say Islam is a close contender for second place.
But you don't find that the violence is in all religion, in equality? You think they are different? I don't.
I'm not sure. I don't think. Yeah, I think.
It has changed now by Modi.
Yeah, I was going to say, Modi might have something to say about that.
But what do you think about the violence now with Islam?
Well, there are
From Islam.
There are some wonderful Muslim
So
Lacanians.
they can't say that there is no violence in this moment, and all the story of all religions are very violent. Buddhism, the same. I don't see any.
Oh, thank you.
I don't think Christianity
I will
is the
be
same.
done.
Yes, yeah.
I think
Are you-
it's something that really to manipulate the people.
Yeah.
When you talk about South America, there is
Thank you.
manipulation from the power, from our own power. That's sure. Because the people miss something. You talk about the absence. Yes. So the religion go inside this kind of absence, I think. And
So you're giving a theory of religious violence located within this wider logic of Das Ding. Is that fair to say? That's amazing.
Well, it's and I do. I don't know if this is what you're saying. Would you say that religion as such opens the door to violence,
yeah.
and you wouldn't discriminate, say, between Hinduism and Christianity?
It's equal, very equal. For me, and for a lot of people.
Dima?
And
What is the name of your new book?
Untitled yet.
The title is in flux.
Too much?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was
I'll have that one.
called What is Religion?
But I like the title the second one that you gave, the Nothing.
Is Nothing Sacred?
I like that.
Rethinking the core idea of religion.
Yeah. I love that title.
Well,
It's-
I liked it too. It's only 2 days old,
it
but I liked it.
catches it catches your attention and to wonder a bit about it. Yeah.
The question I have about it is that it makes
Yeah.
Das Ding into an idea.
Sorry, say again?
The subtitle, Rethinking the Core Idea of Religion, it's effectively treating Das Ding as an idea.
As an idea, that's.
I don't know how I feel about that.
But it is that thing about which you put object R's and so on in order to capture it. See, one way that I understand object R and das Ding is I have a patient and he looks for women, but they must have blue eyes. So I understand that to be the object R of the real thing
Yeah.
for him. So das Ding we cannot relate to it unless we try to find in it some object art that we project into it, but it cannot be totally fantastic. It must have some grab on that thing. Anyway, so that's how I try to understand it.
Yeah.
Richard, do you, if you talk about religion, do you touch in your book anything about Das Ding and group psychology? Because I think they are intimately connected. Mass psychology.
Yeah.
Freud's group psychology, the analysis of the ego, I think is a one-to-one correspondence to me with Das Ding.
Yeah.
And you're seeing
Yeah.
right now in the politics in the world, this is the Das Ding there.
Well, we have one in the White House now. We're enjoying his Dingly character.
Well, yes, yeah.
I think there was something to say to that related to religion.
Yes.
And I think there is, what I'm hearing, I want to describe it, there is the nothingness that could be the abyss, and religion acts like the dangerous seductor that brings you towards closer, maybe with that, I think the seduction is, and the danger is how much you can be drawn into that structure to assuage that anxiety of not knowing without anything, the nothingness.
Well,
It fills,
To me, Das Ding is profoundly seductive.
right?
It's a tremendous seduction about us. What is that? It's a tremendous
And
appeal.
it's dangerous. It could be
Very
violent.
dangerous.
It could, yeah.
Yes, and you can see that.
Lacan talks so much about sublimation and Das Ding. Do you, and then he even says, very briefly, how religion can function as a form of sublimation of Das Ding.
Mhm.
Do you follow his suggestion at that point in the ethics seminar? And do you talk about sublimation in your book?
Yes, some. Not as much as I probably should. I also talk about the relevant to what you're talking about, the sort of seduction into this kind of ecstatic vortex, which can become then the mass psychology of unlimited violence.
Mhm.
I talk about that on one hand, but also the other complicated question of the triangulation in masochism and sadism, the triangulation with the big other, whose instrument I am as a sadist, or who I seek to make anxious as a masochist. This triangulation, which is interesting because it's not quite being seduced by the void, because it's in the master of the law is the point of secure relation, but then all these violent consequences follow. So it's kind of strange, if you either have the seduction of the void, which can be a direct stimulant of mass psychological violence. On the other hand, you can have the big other, the very figure of the law, which is functioning to keep you safe from the abyss, but has its own abyssal effect.
I think he says Das Ding requires the law.
Yeah.
It gives
Oh, yeah.
itself.
Right.
It's like it names itself. So
Yeah.
it's a sort of.
And the
super
law
symbol
requires
of
Das
the
Ding.
real. This is the symbolic signifier of signifiers for
Right.
it in its entirety. So
Right.
it prohibits but invites. Like it's
Right.
the only way actually in.
Right.
So this is what's so dangerous. And presumably your point that it's not coincidental.
Right.
And he's making this argument as well here in the seminar that monotheistic religions are like
Yeah.
this is a refinement, and it becomes this supercharged, thing at this particular moment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So did I hear you correctly that you indicate that das Ding requires the law?
Yes, I think he has a quote exactly like
Yes,
that.
yes, very much
He
so.
says,
That
Das
solved
Ding
my
creates the
question
law.
I had, that solved the
Yeah.
question.
What was the question you had?
Well, what is the connection between das Ding and social order?
Mm-hmm.
It's like
So-
it's clothing. It's like it's symbol. It's the same relation, I believe, between the real and the symbolic.
Which is why the Marquis de Sade is so interesting, because he wants to think of an exchange of enjoyment without mediation of the law, right?
Yeah,
You said
That's why
that
history
Christianity is the
sometimes
most
is-
symptomatic religion. Talk about just the use of the word symptomatic here.
I mean it to name the compensatory and defensive structures that seek to control this exposure to something uncanny and anxiety-producing. So if there's an abyssal dimension opened up, which is very much a dimension at some deep level we wish to see opened up, we wish to be drawn into, we also have to defend ourselves against it. And we
more obsessive and hysterical
Yes.
defenses would come to the
Yes,
fore.
yes,
to
exactly.
deal with that.
And pretty much everything Freud talks about in his various angles of critique of religious life fits into this category of these symptomatic defenses. And my point is that Lacan adds something that I think Freud didn't have. I mean, when Roland says to Freud in his letter opening Civilization and his discontents, well, you didn't take into account the oceanic feeling of oneness with everything. And Freud, remember he says, well, I never had that feeling, so I don't know. And I think Freud is being totally honest there. He says, well, I don't get that. I think Lacan does get it, and I think he says this is something like what attracts him, Lacan, to this problem of das Ding, or to the whole problematic of the real that he opens up. And
As a physician, Freud often also said in some case of lay analysis of the question that he wasn't masochistic enough to actually want to be a doctor himself. Or sadistic. Maybe sadistic.
could have been different. It could have been both on different days.
Sadism.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Deborah, thanks for arranging this as always.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. Yeah.
Nice to see you here again.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Same here. Same here. A lot to think about.
Well done.
Thank you.
Well done. Well done. I hope I didn't push too hard the question.
I was not too rude.
No, not at all. But you do.
You speak French.
No, I appreciate it.
Yeah, these are-
You have not so much accent.
Oh, I've read Freud.
I
as
try.
philosopher.
So, Deborah, what do you think of those dates? Do you think it's too early in January to...
It's not gonna work because I already invited that person from Massachusetts.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, yeah,
In February, and then the last weekend of January, I'm out of town.
Oh, okay.
So like the 30th and
So,
the February
so,
1st.
so do we go to February maybe? Yeah, that's okay.
Okay.
Is that why you were?
I
is that why you
actually,
were taking the reference?
actually appreciate what you said, that we could change it because there's so many things going on. And, yeah, that is fine because actually January is a very loaded month for me. Yeah, so that's good. So we'll move it to February.
Would you?
Yes.
If I find it
I'll
back.
talk to him.
Okay.
Okay.
I would love to see it.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Well, have a nice night.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you too. Good to see you again.
All the best. Take care. See you next time. So, Richard, couple questions. I'm into this.